They wore crowns. They ruled empires. They were called blue bloods, noble, pure, untouchable. But history has something that was never drawn on the map. The stench of pus, the screams in the night, and the rotting from within. Syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease, a slow, silent death, a curse that crept from the bedroom to the throne, destroying bodies, minds, marriages, and the future of entire dynasties. No gunfire, no rebellion. Just one wrong kiss, one weak night, one time without protection. And then, a king who forgot the woman he once loved. A young queen left infertile by her own noble husband. A crown prince who died by suicide in his teenage lover's arms, dragging all of Europe into war. No one dared to name the disease. They called it winter fever, nervous exhaustion, brain affliction. But beneath the velvet robes, syphilis was quietly spilling royal blood. And the truth, buried for over 500 years, cannot stay buried forever. In this video, you'll witness 5 individuals once at the pinnacle of power brought to ruin by the very pleasures they thought they controlled. And if you think this is just ancient history, a reminder: syphilis still exists, silence still exists, and shame still kills more than any virus ever could. Are you ready to hear the truth history tried to erase? Because up next, we begin with a glorious emperor of Persia and end at the collapsing gates of an empire. Abbas II ascended the throne at just 9 years old. A crown seems heavy for a child, but the boy did not tremble. He was sharp, precocious, and had eyes so piercing they seemed to glimpse the future, or at least the truths that no courtier dared speak aloud. This boy king ruled the mighty Safavid Empire, the land we now call Iran, at a time when morality, warfare, and sensuality collided. The empire had once been torn apart by outside forces: the Ottomans, the Mughals, the Russians. But as Abbas came of age, it became clear he was no puppet. In just a few short years, Abbas overthrew the regents and seized power for himself. By the age of 15, he had already demonstrated ruthless political instinct, negotiating peace with the Ottomans, repelling Mughal advances in the east, and restoring order and stability across the empire. The people rejoiced. Poets called him a rising star in the Middle Eastern sky. But that star burned too bright. And when a light burns too long, it scorches the one who carries it. Once firmly seated on the throne, Abbas turned his gaze downward toward the pleasures once forbidden to a guarded prince. Wine, women, the kind of absolute power no one dared question. He adored red wine, but not just any kind. It had to be a nice scented. Shiraz poured into a gold goblet encrusted with rubies, a diplomatic gift from the Russian Tsar. After every military victory, week-long banquets were held at the palace, where Islamic customs were left outside the carved teak doors. Music played through the night. Dancers, kohl-lined eyes and silk dresses flying, floated like sleepless spirits. The air reeked of incense, nutmeg, and the sweat of men and women indistinguishable from one another. In that space, the Shah was a god. No laws, no questions, only pleasure. Abbas began building a vast harem, hundreds of concubines. Some were princesses from conquered lands, but most were slaves from the Caucasus, Central Asia, even Africa. Many were no older than 14. They entered the palace weeping, and if they were lucky, left it in silence. No one knows exactly when the illness began. Maybe it was one night deep in the lantern-lit halls when a young slave smiled a little too long. Maybe it was a Venetian merchant who brought something in his blood, along with his silk. Wherever it began, one thing is certain: it found its way into the emperor's bloodstream. First came the strange headaches, a searing pain across the temples that made him cancel meetings with his ministers. Then a lesion at the corner of his lip, dismissed by the court physician as a mouth ulcer. But no one spoke the truth. No one dared name the disease. No one asked why more and more concubines were disappearing from the palace. There were only whispers that on some nights the Shah screamed in his sleep, drenched in sweat and blood. That he laughed at his reflection, then shattered every mirror in sight. that his hand once steady around that ruby goblet had begun to tremble, not from emotion, but from a nervous system breaking down. Abbas was only 34. He is remembered as one of the last great kings of Persia. But people also remember that in his final years he vanished from public view, that the eyes once compared to divine fire became hollow and white, and that after his death the empire began to crumble, as if held together only by the will of one man already rotting from within. There was no grand funeral, no towering statue, only one cold line in the royal record: died in agony. Courtiers murmured. The people wept. But everyone knew the Safavid dynasty had started to bleed from that moment on. And that blood never stopped flowing, not just through war, but through every night of debauchery, every nameless embrace. Abbas did not die from a battlefield wound. He died from a wound buried in pleasure, a wound inflicted by desire, the one thing rulers always believe they can indulge in without consequence. That's the truth. Some empires fall to enemies, but others fall from one kiss too many. From the moment he was born, Rudolf carried the weight of expectation. As the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth, known to the world as Sisi, Rudolf was seen as the living future of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A child born to inherit power, uphold the honor of the Habsburg line, and keep Europe from descending into chaos. But perhaps because he was born in such dazzling light, the shadows clung to him more than to anyone else. At just 6 years old, Rudolf was torn away from the only person who had ever held him with unconditional love, his mother. Why Elizabeth was deemed too soft, too emotional to raise a future emperor. So the young prince was handed over to a tutor, or more accurately, a warden infamous for his brutal methods. Rudolf was beaten for crying, starved if he answered questions incorrectly. He learned to swallow tears, to stay silent through pain, to become a machine, emotionless, voiceless. But Rudolf was no machine. He grew into a sensitive, brilliant, and increasingly tormented young man. While his father stood for military discipline and religious conservatism, Rudolf read, Voltaire loved science, supported freedom of the press, and believed in separating church from state. He wanted to be a different kind of king, more modern, more human, more connected. But the court didn't want that. They wanted a perfect replica of Franz Joseph. And when Rudolf didn't fit the mold, they tried to break him until he did. At 23, to silence rumors and preserve the royal image, Rudolf was married off to Princess Stephanie of Belgium, just 17 at the time. She arrived in Vienna with dreams of being the wife of a future emperor. But at their very first meeting, Rudolf showed up with his mistress on his arm. A public humiliation no one dared challenge. They married, a daughter was born. And then, love ended. Rudolf didn't just grow distant. He gave Stephanie two things, gonorrhea and syphilis. In an age before antibiotics, no one truly understood what they had. Stephanie simply felt a burning pain in the abdomen and was diagnosed with digestive issues. When the pain passed, her fertility was gone. At age 20, she was considered a broken vessel, useless in her role as heir producer. From that point on, there was no intimacy. Rudolf didn't care. He drank heavily, chain-smoked, partied with libertine friends, and sought out women of every kind, from noblewomen to prostitutes. Inside, he was crumbling. Outside, he smiled and waved. A beautiful puppet. Rudolf's mind began to crack. He became paranoid, quick-tempered, emotionally unstable. Then came the depression so deep. He started writing to women from his past, begging them to die with him. One woman refused and brought the letter to the police. No one investigated. No one wanted to be involved. Eventually, Rudolf found a new companion, Baroness Mary Vetsera, just 17. Young, naive, and utterly infatuated. She agreed. On January 29, 1889, Rudolf and Mary traveled to a small hunting lodge called Meyerling. No one knows exactly what happened that night. All we know is this: the next morning, 2 bodies were found. Mary had been shot in the head. Rudolf had taken his own life. His body lay on the bed with a hastily scribbled note by his pillow. Death is the only path to freedom. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was shaken. Emperor Franz Joseph lost his only son, the public whispered. The nobility panicked, but the court denied everything. They claimed Rudolf had died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Mary's body was smuggled out like a package placed in a carriage and buried quietly in an unmarked grave. From that moment on, everything began to collapse. Rudolf had been the last hope for Habsburg reform. With no visionary heir left, Franz Ferdinand, the next in line, assumed the role. 25 years later, he was assassinated in Sarajevo, sparking World War I. And it all began with a sexually transmitted disease, with a lie whispered in a bedroom, with silence, shame, and cover-ups, with a father who didn't listen, with a little boy beaten for crying. And it ended in blood, the blood of a young man and a teenage girl lying dead in an Austrian winter. They say love can save the world, but in Meyerling it proved something else. Sometimes when you teach a child that tears are weakness, you're building a ticking bomb. And when a disease isn't named, it will find its own way to scream. John Wilmot never wanted to be a good man. He was born with too much privilege, the Earl of Rochester, son of a royal war hero, who had risked his life for King Charles II and raised among wine, Oxford halls, and hollow flattery. But what made John Wilmot stand out wasn't his lineage, it was his mind and his recklessness. A reckless brilliance fused with poetic genius, biting satire, and self-destructive debauchery. At 13, he entered Oxford. At 14, he was already writing satirical verses that left professors speechless. After graduating, King Charles II granted him a tour of Europe to learn about civilization. But what John learned didn't come from books. He learned how to gamble away his fortune, sleep with whomever he pleased, and turn every rule into a joke. When he returned to England, he brought no books, only disease, and a deep disdain for everything. Wilmot married a noblewoman named Elizabeth Malet, not out of love, but through abduction. She had once rejected his proposal, so John, with his mother's help, planned to kidnap her off a London street. The scandal rocked the aristocracy. Wilmot was thrown into the Tower of London. But just months later, he was released, because he was an earl, and because the king found it amusing. When Charles II needed a field aide in the war against the Dutch, he brought Wilmot along. John returned in glory, and this time Elizabeth agreed to marry him. But any peace, if it existed at all, lasted mere weeks. John Wilmot was not made to be anyone's husband. He became the ringleader of the most debauched aristocratic clique in England, the Merry Gang. They partied all night, wrote obscene poetry, mocked the church, and turned every court meeting into a farce. Wilmot had a particular fondness for actresses. He supported Nell Gwynn, who would become the king's official mistress, and elevated Elizabeth Barry, who rose to be the greatest stage actress of her era. He loved her. Then he envied her. Then he abandoned her. To John Wilmot, everything, even someone else's pain, was a performance. But in the chaos, he wrote some of the most brilliant poetry of the 17th century, dark, biting, erotic, and deeply profound. He mocked hypocrisy, exposed the hollowness of nobility, and dared to write openly about sex, death, and syphilis, perhaps because he knew it better than anyone. Before long, John was banished from court. The reason he staged a play that satirized King Charles himself, the very man who had once indulged him. Exiled Wilmot didn't retreat. Instead, he reinvented himself as a shadowy figure, Dr. Bendo, a fertility physician for desperate London ladies. Sometimes he disguised himself as Mrs. Bendo, an Italian midwife with a fake accent performing gynecological exams on barren noblewomen. Some of them did become pregnant. And people whispered Bendo performed miracles, from genius to fraud, from earl to quack doctor, from court poet to social outcast. But the cruelest part, he always knew he was mocking himself too. Syphilis began devouring him piece by piece. First came the fevers, then insomnia, blurry vision, migraines like nails driven into his skull. His nose, once described proudly as straight as a scepter, began to rot. Those close to him said he wore scarves to hide the decaying part of his face. He couldn't read. He couldn't write. He couldn't use the bathroom on his own. At 33, John Wilmot lay bedridden, blind, foul-smelling, exhausted, dictating his final verses to a scribe. He didn't ask God for forgiveness. He didn't repent. He simply said, "I am living proof that even the sharpest mind cannot save a soul led astray." He died in delirium, no grand funeral, no royal eulogy, no statue. But his legacy lived on in poetry, in the cursed brilliance of his life, and in a truth most try to avoid, that talent cannot protect you from what you sow in your own bed. John Wilmot wasn't killed by poison enemies or war. He died from the very things he pursued: absolute freedom, unrestrained pleasure, and contempt for all boundaries. He was a falling star, brilliant, furious, and burned alive by his own light. Lewis, I was never meant to be king. And because of that, for the first third of his life, he lived as one of the rarest creatures in royalty, a free man, romantic, intelligent, unburdened by the weight of legacy. Born in 1838, the second son of Queen Maria II of Portugal, Louis stood behind his elder brother Pedro in the line of succession. And that gave him peace. With no throne awaiting him, Louis buried himself in books. He studied French, English, and German, and became so enamored with Shakespeare that he personally translated the Bard's immortal plays into Portuguese. The young prince was dubbed a lover of language, but don't be mistaken, he wasn't some reclusive bookworm. Louis had a gentle charm, a calm demeanor, eyes full of quiet sorrow, and a wise smile. Women across Europe adored him, from princesses to stage actresses. His life truly felt like a fairy tale. Until one day, the fairy tale was torn apart by death. In 1861, an epidemic, perhaps typhoid or cholera, swept through the Portuguese royal family. In just a few short months, Louis's brother, King Pedro V, was dead. Then his two younger brothers, Fernando and João, followed. And in the span of a single mourning season, Louis, the Prince of Poetry, was unwillingly thrust onto the throne of a kingdom in crisis. No time to prepare, no choice to refuse, only a crown and a chilling reminder: the empire needs an heir. Immediately, the sooner the better. Louis wrote desperate letters to royal relatives across Europe. He sought advice from Queen Victoria, his cousin in England, and King Leopold I of Belgium, his uncle, about a suitable wife. Maria Theresa of Austria was suggested first, but at just 16 her father refused the match. And so Louis accepted another candidate, Maria Pia of Savoy, the 14-year-old daughter of the King of Italy. He was 23, she was 14. He was described as a gentle emperor with an artist's soul, she innocent and full of admiration. Their wedding was grand like hundreds of other royal unions, but this one came with a desperate hope that she would bear sons and save the crumbling house of Braganza. Maria Pia gave birth to 2 sons before she turned 18. She tried earnestly to fulfill her role, all while holding on to the tender heart of a girl, thrown into court life far too soon. But just a few years later, that heart would shatter. Louis, her once affectionate husband, began vanishing from their bedroom more and more. Council meetings ran late, and in the shadows of Lisbon, whispers began about a beautiful actress named Rosa de Lima and the long nights Louis spent with her in seaside villas. Maria Pia grew furious. She took long absences under the guise of recovering her health. Rumors even swirled that she too had taken a lover, a revenge of sorts. But none of it changed the truth. Her king lived in 2 worlds, one of courtly duty and one of forbidden passion. And somewhere between those worlds, Louis caught something. Maybe from Rosa, maybe from someone else. No one knows for sure. But by 1887, the signs were undeniable. He became unusually silent. Severe headaches forced him away from his desk. Sometimes he'd stare into space and laugh for no reason. He began forgetting basic words when writing. And one night, he seized violently, Diagnosis: neurosyphilis, the final stage of syphilis, when the bacteria invade the central nervous system, destroying the brain from the inside out. From a language scholar, Lewis deteriorated into a man who mumbled incoherently, his eyes wild with fear, prone to angry outbursts over nothing. Doctors urged the court to keep him away from the public. Advisors began signing decrees in his name. Maria Pia visited less often, partly from heartbreak, partly from fear. In 1889, Lewis died. He was only 50. The funeral was grand. People wept not just for a king lost, but for a man who once radiated brilliance, now consumed by the shadows of illness and solitude. There is no statue commemorating that he was one of the first to translate Shakespeare into Portuguese. No one speaks of the gentle glimmer in his eyes before the crown. People only remember this. He was a king forgotten, betrayed by his own body, a body once symbolic of grace and intellect, but brought low by a venereal disease passed through secret kisses, a disease that didn't just take his life. It erased the memory of who he once was. Joseph, I was not born to be ordinary. As the eldest son of Emperor Leopold, the first ruler of one of the most powerful empires in Europe, Joseph was raised amid courtly music, lavish ceremonies, and constant reminders of his duty to history. From a young age, he was groomed to inherit the Habsburg throne, a dynasty built on the ideals of pure blood, divine obligation, and the belief in immortality through male heirs. And as expected, Joseph grew up handsome, intelligent, confident, and debauched. He was not withdrawn like Louis the Fun, nor tortured like Rudolph. Joseph embraced luxury, but not in the formal sense. He loved parties, he loved hunting, and above all, he loved women, the more the better. By the age of 21, his mother, Empress Eleanor Magdalena, was begging him to marry, desperate to put an end to the growing rumors surrounding the prince's scandalous sex life. The chosen bride was Wilhelmina Amalie, a German princess 5 years older than Joseph. She was pious, serious, and tested for fertility before the wedding. Such was the brutal reality. For royal women, love was irrelevant, only a working womb mattered. At first, their marriage seemed functional. Wilhelmina gave birth to 3 children, including a son named Leopold Joseph. But the boy died in infancy, likely from a mysterious illness, which many suspect was linked to sexually transmitted infections in the blood of his parents. From then on, Joseph grew anxious. Not from grief, but from fear. Fear that the Habsburg line might end with him. Instead of turning back to his wife and trying again for a son, Joseph did the opposite. He ran from his duty. Every hunting trip was accompanied by his close friend, Count Franz Christoph Kinsky, whose main role was to arrange young peasant girls for the emperor's entertainment. Sometimes they were nobles, sometimes mere servants. One rumor claimed Joseph had an affair with the gardener's daughter right inside the palace grounds. He didn't hide it. He didn't care about scandal. And he never used protection. One day, Wilhelmina began experiencing strange pains, unusual vaginal symptoms, low fevers that lingered, sleepless nights. No one dared speak the truth. Court doctors offered vague diagnoses, but she knew she had contracted a disease from her husband. She said nothing, only withdrew into prayer. But prayer cannot cure syphilis. Her body weakened day by day. Most tragically, she was never able to conceive again. The court panicked. No male heir, no succession plan. And this wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political crisis. The Habsburg Empire was built on male inheritance. Without a son, Joseph tried to hold on to power through political presence, but even that began to falter. He joined the War of Spanish Succession, but failed to secure any major victories. Whispers spread through the court. Joseph was more skilled in bed than on the battlefield. Eventually, he retreated to the arms of his official mistress, Countess Marianne Palffy, the first woman in Austrian court history to be publicly acknowledged as mistress of the emperor. She sat at court banquets, received gifts from the royal treasury, and became a living symbol of royal impotence. When an emperor elevates his mistress to the same status as his empress, it means decorum is dead. Joseph Thirst's death came swiftly and grimly. At 32, he fell ill, many sources suspect from advanced syphilis. He suffered crippling headaches, constant fatigue, and worsening memory. As he lay in bed, Wilhelmina came to his side, held his hand, and for the first time in years, he apologized. He promised that if he survived, he would change. He would be faithful. He would not repeat his mistakes. He never got the chance to keep that promise. Joseph died in agony, leaving behind an empty throne and a crumbling legacy. No heir, no victories, no honor. Only a younger brother, Charles VI, and a bloodline growing ever more fragile. Charles ascended the throne in panic. He quickly signed a decree allowing his daughter Maria Theresa to inherit the crown if no male heir existed. But he too fathered only daughters. And when he died, all of Europe spiraled into chaos, triggering the War of Austrian Succession, all because of a sexually transmitted disease. Syphilis doesn't just take lives. It takes away fertility. And when the fate of an empire rests in a woman's womb, the entire throne begins to shake. Joseph I didn't just die from his own sins. He dragged down a dynasty, a bloodline, and an entire chapter of European history. Empires don't always need foreign enemies to collapse. Sometimes all it takes is one reckless night. And one man who thought he was immortal. 5 people, 5 tragedies, 1 disease. None of them died on the battlefield. None were assassinated. They were destroyed by what seemed like harmless choices, hidden nights, silent embraces. Syphilis doesn't just kill. It kills fertility, kills memory, kills trust. And in the end, it kills dynasties. From Abbas II of Persia to Joseph I of Habsburg, each carried a wound no one could see until it was too late. And they didn't just carry it in their blood, they carried it into history. Today you saw that real history isn't polished like textbooks. It smells, it festers, it holds truths that people once risked everything to hide. So what do you think? Who among them was the victim? Who was the cause? And if you could say one thing to them, what would it be? Leave a comment below. And if you believe this story needs to be heard, share it. Because sometimes a video doesn't change the world, but it might make someone stop and not repeat the same mistake.